Hey there, welcome to Dread Lullabies. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. You know, they say the night is for resting, but for some, the darkness is where the real world begins. Tonight, I've put together a few true stories that are meant to be heard in the quiet. Stories that remind us that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are more real than we'd like to believe. Before we get lost in the dark, I'd love to know where you're joining me from. So feel free to drop a comment and tell me where you're listening tonight. And if you find yourself coming back for more, maybe consider liking the video and subscribing. It really helps me keep these lullabies going for you. So, pull up the covers, get comfortable, and let's see what the night has in store for us. This happened to me about 2 years ago, sometime in early December. It was a strange period in my life, and even now I still think about that night from time to time. I've never been someone who strongly believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. I've always tried to look for logical explanations for things, and most of the time that approach has served me well. But that experience was one of those moments where logic didn't seem to fit as neatly as I would have liked. At the time, my ex-wife and I were living together in a rental house. She had always been the complete opposite of me when it came to things like the paranormal. She firmly believed that spirits and unexplained forces existed. She would watch documentaries about hauntings, talk about strange experiences people had, and point out things she thought were signs of supernatural activity. I never really shared that interest. Whenever she mentioned something like that, I usually brushed it off or assumed there was a simple explanation. Before we moved into the house where all of this happened, we had stayed in another rental for a while. Even in that place, she would sometimes make comments about shadows or strange feelings. She'd say things like she felt like someone was watching her or that she noticed movement in the corner of her eye. I always assumed it was just her imagination or maybe tricks of the lighting in the house. I didn't give those comments much attention. Eventually, we moved into a different house, hoping for a fresh start and a better environment. The house itself was fairly ordinary. It was a quiet place in a normal neighborhood, and nothing that looked creepy or unusual from the outside. At first, everything seemed fine. But after we settled in, my ex-wife started mentioning things again. Actually, she mentioned them more often than before. She would say that she noticed shadows moving in rooms when no one else was there. Sometimes she'd talk about strange feelings like the sense that someone was standing nearby even when the house was empty. I remember rolling my eyes at some of those comments. To me, it just sounded like her imagination getting the better of her. Still, after hearing the same kinds of comments repeatedly, something strange happened. I started paying closer attention to the house myself, and once I started paying attention, I began noticing things too. At first, they were small things, little movements or sounds that you might normally ignore if you weren't thinking about them. For example, I'd sometimes hear doors shifting slightly on their hinges, even though no one was near them. It wasn't dramatic movement, just a slow creak or a gentle swing that caught my attention. Then there were the footsteps. More than once I remember hearing what sounded like someone walking through another room while I was sitting in the living room. It was never loud or obvious, but the sound was clear enough to make me pause and listen. Each time I got up to check, there was nothing there. The house would also make these sudden loud sounds every now and then. Sharp bangs or cracking noises like something had slammed into a wall or hit the edge of a counter. At first, I assumed it was just the house settling or maybe pipes shifting in the cold weather. Older houses often make strange noises, especially when temperatures change. But after a while, those noises started happening more frequently. Even then, I still tried to explain everything logically. Houses make noises, doors move because of air pressure, sounds travel strangely through walls and floors. There are plenty of normal explanations for things like that. Then December arrived. At the beginning of that month, my ex-wife left for deployment. Suddenly the house felt very different, not just emotionally, but physically too. Living alone after sharing a space with someone else always creates a strange kind of silence. The house felt bigger and emptier at the same time, but something else changed too. It felt like the strange activity in the house increased once she left. Maybe it was just because I was alone and more aware of every little sound. When you're by yourself, even normal noises stand out more. But it really did seem like things were happening more often. Doors would shift when I wasn't near them. I would hear footsteps again, sometimes when I was certain no one else could possibly be in the house. Those sudden banging noises continued as well. A few of them were loud enough to make me jump up and check every room. Each time I searched the house, I found nothing. Eventually, I just tried to ignore it and go about my routine. Then one night, something happened that stuck with me more than anything else. It was late, and I stepped outside onto the back porch to have a cigarette. It was something I did fairly often when I needed a moment to relax. The night air was cold, typical for December, and the yard was quiet and still. Before going outside, I followed one of my usual habits. I've always had this routine of checking doorknobs and locks when I leave the house, even if I'm only stepping outside for a minute. It's just something I've done for years without thinking about it. That night, I remember very clearly interacting with the sliding glass door that led to the porch. I locked it, then I unlocked it again. I did that out of habit before sliding it closed behind me. I also flipped on the porch light so I could see outside. The light cast a soft glow across the wooden porch and part of the backyard. Everything looked normal and quiet. When I pulled the sliding door closed, it didn't shut completely. There was a small gap left open, maybe about half an inch. I didn't bother fixing it because I planned to be outside for less than a minute. I stepped onto the porch, lit my cigarette, and leaned against the railing. I had barely been outside for a minute when I heard something behind me. A click. Right after the sound, the porch light suddenly turned off. The entire porch dropped into darkness. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. My first thought was that maybe the bulb had burned out or the switch inside had somehow been bumped. But then I remembered something important. The switch for that light was inside the house. I turned and looked through the sliding glass door into the kitchen. The lights inside were still on, but I didn't see anyone. No movement, no shadows. The house looked completely empty. That moment was when the uneasy feeling really hit me. The light had clearly turned off from inside, and I knew for a fact that I was alone in the house. I stood there for a few seconds staring inside, trying to decide what to do. Finally, I decided that if someone was somehow inside, I needed to check. The problem was that the sliding door was now locked. Since it hadn't been fully closed when I stepped outside, I hadn't thought about the lock, but now it was shut and locked from the inside. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went around to the bathroom window, which I knew I could climb through if necessary. It wasn't exactly graceful, but I managed to get inside the house that way. Once I was in, my heart was racing. I went straight to my bedroom and reached under the mattress, where I kept a small hatchet. Holding that hatchet, I started checking every room in the house: the kitchen, the living room, the hallway, the bathroom, every closet. I checked behind furniture, looked into dark corners, and even stepped outside again to check around the yard. There was nothing. No sign that anyone had been there. No open windows. No unlocked doors. Nothing out of place at all. Eventually, I set the hatchet down and just stood in the quiet house, trying to process what had happened. Strangely enough, after that night, something changed. The strange sounds and movements that had been happening in the house started fading away. The footsteps stopped. The doors no longer shifted unexpectedly. Even the loud banging noises disappeared. Within a few weeks, the house felt completely normal again. Whatever had been happening seemed to stop as suddenly as it had started. Why, to this day, I still don't have a clear explanation for what happened that night. Maybe there was some strange mechanical issue with the light switch. Maybe the door lock shifted when the door moved. Maybe there was a logical explanation I simply never discovered, or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that I was alone on that porch when the light clicked off, and when I searched the house, there was no one there. Back when I was in high school, I had an unbelievable amount of hair. I mean, I still have a lot of hair even now, but back then, it honestly felt like it was twice as thick and heavy. It was long, dense, and always a little difficult to deal with. Some people struggle with thin hair that refuses to hold a style, but my problem was the opposite. My hair had so much volume that sometimes it felt like it had its own personality. My friends used to joke that it was almost alive because it never behaved the way I wanted it to. Washing it, drying it, brushing it, and trying to style it always turned into a whole project. Because of that, I often relied on my friend Rachel to help me with it. Rachel loved anything related to hair and makeup. Even when we were teenagers, she already talked about becoming a professional hairstylist someday. Whenever we spent time together, she liked experimenting with braids, curls, different updos, and all sorts of styles she had seen in magazines or online. She treated hair like a creative hobby, and I was always happy to volunteer as the person she practiced on. It meant I didn't have to struggle with my hair alone, and she got to try out new techniques. One evening, I decided to walk over to Rachel's house so she could do something nice with my hair. Earlier that night, I had taken a shower, and after washing it, I didn't bother drying or styling it properly. Anyone who has very long hair knows how heavy it feels when it's wet. Instead of dealing with it, I simply twisted it all together and piled it up into a giant bun on top of my head. It was the kind of messy bun that barely stays together but keeps everything out of the way. My hair was still damp and warm from the shower, and the bun was so big it almost looked ridiculous sitting on top of my head. Once I had it tied up like that, I headed out the door and started walking toward Rachel's house. The place where we grew up was extremely rural. It wasn't like living in a town where houses are close together and streets are lined with lights. Out there, properties were spread far apart, and most of the roads felt more like dirt paths cutting through fields and woods. Rachel didn't live far away from me, but the walk to her house went through an area surrounded by trees and tall grass. During the daytime, it looked peaceful and beautiful, but at night it could feel quiet in a slightly eerie way. Still, I wasn't worried. I had walked that path many times before, and it felt completely normal to me. The night air was cool and fresh, and the sky above the fields looked wide and open. I remember enjoying the quiet while I walked, thinking about how nice it would be once Rachel turned my wild hair into something that actually looked decent. My damp bun sat heavy on my head the whole time. I didn't think much about it. It was just my usual lazy solution for dealing with wet hair. Eventually, I reached Rachel's house and knocked on the door. She greeted me with her usual excitement, already eager to start working on my hair. We went straight to her room, which at that point had practically become her own little hairstyling space. Her vanity was covered with brushes, combs, hair ties, clips, sprays, and various styling tools. She treated it almost like a real salon station, even though we were just teenagers hanging out after school. Her vanity mirror was large and framed with bright lights running down both sides. When the lights were on, they made the entire mirror glow, which helped her see every detail while working on someone's hair or makeup. I sat down on the stool in front of the mirror while Rachel stood behind me. From my seat, I could see both of us reflected clearly in the mirror. My giant bun was still perched on top of my head, looking even bigger now that it was under the bright lights. Rachel laughed when she saw it. She reached up and started pulling the pins and ties out of the bun so she could let my hair down. As she worked, the heavy bundle slowly began to unravel. Wet strands started falling down around my shoulders and back. My hair kept coming down in thick sections as she loosened the twists. I watched the process through the mirror, seeing my hair slowly spill out from the bun. Then something strange happened. Right above my head, in the reflection of the mirror, I noticed movement. At first, it looked like small, dark shapes lifting upward from the top of my hair. I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, but within seconds the movement became clearer. More and more of the shapes began rising into the air. Suddenly there were dozens of them, moths, wasps, bees. One after another they lifted up from my hair and started flying around the room. For a moment neither Rachel nor I reacted. We both just stared at the mirror in disbelief as the insects floated upward into the light. The bright vanity lights made their wings shimmer slightly as they moved toward the ceiling. It almost looked surreal. For a split second, it looked like a cloud of tiny winged creatures rising up into the air. In that strange moment of shock, the scene almost looked peaceful, like little spirits drifting upward. Then reality hit. My hair had basically been hiding an entire insect gathering. Apparently, insects are extremely attracted to the scent of shampoo. When you combine that with warm, damp hair, twisted tightly into a big bun, you create the perfect little shelter. During my walk along that rural path, a whole group of curious insects must have decided that my bun looked like a cozy place to land. Without me realizing it, they had settled inside my hair. Rachel and I stared at the mirror for about 2 seconds longer before the panic finally kicked in. Rachel suddenly jumped backward away from the vanity. I sat frozen on the stool with wide eyes while the insects buzzed around the room, confused by the bright lights and sudden movement. Some of them flew directly toward the lights along the mirror. Others drifted toward the ceiling. A few circled around the room as if trying to figure out what had just happened. The quiet room turned into complete chaos. Rachel grabbed a brush and started waving it through the air while ducking at the same time. I jumped up from the stool and instinctively started swatting around my head, terrified that more insects were still tangled in my hair. For a few moments, the room was filled with nervous yelling, buzzing wings, and the sound of us both scrambling around trying to avoid the swarm. Then something strange happened. Instead of getting aggressive, most of the insects simply seemed confused. A few flew toward the window, drawn by the darkness outside. Others settled briefly on the walls before flying off again. The panic slowly faded as we realized something important. None of them were actually attacking us. Even though there were dozens of insects flying around the room, not one of them tried to sting me. Considering that there had been bees and wasps mixed in with the moths, that fact still feels like a small miracle. Within a few minutes, the chaos began settling down. Some insects found their way out through a slightly open window. Others disappeared into corners or drifted away from the lights. Rachel and I stood there in the middle of the room, breathing heavily and staring at each other. Then we both started laughing. The whole situation was just too ridiculous. The idea that I had walked all the way down that dark rural path with dozens of insects hiding inside my hair was unbelievably absurd. I kept imagining what it would have looked like if someone had passed me on the road at that moment. Just a teenager walking calmly through the countryside with a giant bun on top of her head, completely unaware that it was secretly filled with moths, bees, and wasps. The more we thought about it, the harder we laughed. Eventually, Rachel finished letting my hair down and carefully checked it to make sure there were no more unexpected passengers hiding inside. Once we were sure everything was clear, she finally started styling it the way we had originally planned. But that strange moment stayed with both of us. Even now, years later, it's still one of those bizarre memories that comes up whenever we talk about high school. I can still picture the reflection in that mirror so clearly. The bright vanity lights, the thick strands of my hair falling down, and then suddenly dozens of tiny wings rising into the air. Looking back now, the whole experience feels more funny than anything else. At the time, it was definitely shocking, but it turned into one of those strange stories that sticks with you for life. And I definitely learned an important lesson that night. If you're walking through rural areas with freshly washed hair, maybe don't twist it into a giant damp bun, because apparently, to insects, that looks exactly like a very comfortable place to live. When I was younger, I had a Siamese cat who meant the world to me. I adored him in the way kids sometimes attach themselves completely to a pet, and he seemed to feel the same about me. At that time, I was being homeschooled, so I spent most of my days at home. Whenever I sat down to work on my assignments, he would jump up onto my lap like it was the most natural place in the world for him to be. He would curl up there and stay with me while I worked, sometimes purring softly, sometimes just sitting quietly, as if he understood that we were both doing something important. At night, it was always the same routine. When it was time for me to go to bed, he would follow me into my room and settle in beside me. Without fail, he curled up next to me every single night. It became such a normal part of my life that I didn't even think about it. It was just how things were. I would fall asleep with him there, warm and quiet, and when I woke up in the morning, he would still be beside me. When I eventually started going to public school, instead of being homeschooled, the routine changed a little, but he was still there for me in his own way. Every afternoon when I came home from school, he would greet me. Sometimes he would be waiting near the door, and other times he would appear from somewhere in the house as soon as he heard me come in. It always felt like he had been waiting for me all day. For a kid, having a pet like that can mean everything. Animals don't judge you or misunderstand you the way people sometimes do. They just stay with you and accept you completely. My Siamese cat was part of my everyday life, part of the comfort of home. Then in 2007, when I was in 5th grade, he died. Losing him hit me much harder than I expected. At that age, I had already dealt with difficult emotions before, but this felt different. The house suddenly felt empty in a way I had never noticed before. His usual spots were still there, but he wasn't in them anymore. I cried constantly for weeks after he died. Sometimes it would come out of nowhere, other times it would happen at night when I woke up in the dark. For years, I had been used to opening my eyes and seeing him curled up beside me on the bed. After he was gone, every time I woke up and saw that empty space, it felt like a fresh wave of pain. It was like being reminded all over again that he was really gone. Later that same year, in September, my family got another cat as an early birthday present for me. She was a beautiful silver tabby with soft fur, bright green eyes, and a short little tail that made her look slightly different from most cats. She had a playful personality and was full of energy. Of course, she couldn't replace my Siamese cat. No pet ever truly replaces another, but she became important to me in her own way. She helped bring life back into the house, and she helped me slowly begin to heal from the grief I had been carrying. She wasn't as cuddly as my Siamese had been. Instead of curling up next to me all the time, she preferred running around, chasing toys, and exploring the house. She loved to play more than she loved to sit still, but that playful energy helped pull me out of some of the sadness I had been feeling. For a while, things felt a little better. Then 2009 arrived, and that year became very difficult for me in a completely different way. I had been dealing with mental health struggles for most of my life, and by that point, depression had become something I battled regularly. At school, I didn't really have friends. I felt isolated and disconnected from the people around me. The one place where I did feel like I belonged was online. Through the internet, I had found a small group of people, who I talked to regularly. We would chat, joke around, and share things about our lives. Even though we had never met in person, I believed they were my friends. For someone who felt alone in real life, that group meant a lot to me. Then one day, just a couple weeks before Christmas, everything changed. Out of nowhere, the group turned on me. I still don't fully understand what caused it. They suddenly told me they didn't want to hear from me anymore. They pushed me out of the group and made it clear that they didn't want another message from me. Even though it was just an online community, the rejection hurt deeply. I had trusted them. I had believed they cared about me the way friends are supposed to. When they cut me off like that, it felt like the ground dropped out from under me. I tried to pretend it didn't affect me, especially around my family. I didn't want them to think I was being overly dramatic about something that happened on the internet. So I kept most of my emotions to myself. I would only cry when I was alone. But inside, I was struggling more than anyone around me realized. A few days after everything happened, I was sitting at the computer again. The same chat window was open on the screen. I could still see the group talking to each other, continuing their conversations like nothing had changed. I sat there staring at it, watching them laugh and talk without me. I tried to hold my emotions in, but I couldn't stop a few tears from falling. That was when I suddenly heard a loud meow behind me. It was so clear and familiar that it made me freeze. Slowly, I turned around in my chair. Sitting near the fireplace in the living room was my Siamese cat. He was in one of his old favorite spots, sitting there, just like he used to. He was looking directly at me. For a moment, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Then the realization hit me all at once. He had been gone for 2 years. The shock completely overwhelmed me. I started screaming without even realizing it. The chair tipped over as I scrambled backward, and I ended up on the floor. I lay there crying uncontrollably, overwhelmed by a mix of grief, confusion, and disbelief. My silver tabby came running over and sat beside me while I cried. A few seconds later, my mom rushed into the room, alarmed by the noise. She kept asking what had happened and whether I was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her about what had really been upsetting me. I didn't want to explain the situation with the online friends because I was afraid she wouldn't understand why it hurt so much. So instead, I told her that I had seen my Siamese cat sitting by the fireplace. Years have passed since that moment. A lot happened in the time after that. The year 2010 was especially rough for me. I was involved in a serious accident, had a nervous breakdown, and lost another cat that I cared about. It felt like one difficult event after another. But eventually things began to improve. At school, I finally started making a few real friends who accepted me as I was. They didn't judge me for struggling with mental illness. They simply treated me like a normal person, and that meant more than they probably realized. At the end of 2010, we adopted another kitten. That little cat brought a lot of happiness back into my life. He quickly became one of the best things in my world. By the beginning of 2011, life had started to feel hopeful again. I had friends both online and offline. I was doing better in school, and slowly my life felt more stable. I even turned 18 recently, but one strange thing has continued to happen over the years. Every once in a while, especially when I'm feeling very upset or overwhelmed, I see my Siamese cat again. Yes, sometimes I see him walking quietly through the house the way he used to. Other times he appears sitting by the fireplace in his old spot. Occasionally, I even see him curled up on my bed the way he used to sleep beside me. It doesn't frighten me anymore. If anything, it feels strangely comforting. I don't know whether it's just my mind remembering him so strongly that it creates those brief moments where I think I see him again. Maybe it's my brain holding on to a memory that still brings me comfort during difficult times. Whatever the explanation is, the feeling is always the same. For a moment, it feels like my old friend is still watching over me. When I was about 6 years old, something strange happened during recess at school, and even now I still think about it from time to time. Kids remember certain childhood moments very clearly, especially the ones that are confusing or a little frightening. This was one of those moments for me. Our playground had what felt like a massive wooden castle play structure. At that age, it seemed enormous, like something out of a fantasy story. The structure had towers, ladders, slides, and one of its main features was a wooden bridge that connected two platforms. The bridge was raised several feet off the ground, probably about 6 feet or so. On both sides of it were thick metal chains that acted as rails, so kids wouldn't fall off while running across. Below the structure, there wasn't pavement like modern playgrounds often have. Instead, the ground was covered in sawdust. It was meant to soften falls, and it gave the whole playground a rough wooden smell that I still remember when I think about that place. One day during recess, my friends and I were running around the castle playset like we usually did. Kids were chasing each other, racing across the bridge, climbing up ladders and shouting with that endless energy children seem to have. I remember running across the bridge and then suddenly stopping in the middle of it. For some reason, I turned around and looked out toward the open field next to the playground. I don't remember exactly what caught my attention, but I know I paused there for a moment. Then everything goes blank. The next thing I clearly remember is lying on my back on the ground, about 15 feet away from the bridge. When my memory returns, while I'm staring up at the sky with a small group of my friends and one of the teachers standing around me looking down. It was confusing because I had no memory of falling or jumping. One second I had been standing on the bridge, and the next second I was on the ground surrounded by people. I remember sitting up slowly and asking what had happened. One of the kids standing nearby answered immediately. He said, "You floated." As soon as he said that, the other kids around him reacted strangely. Several of them gave him sharp looks, almost like they didn't want him to say that. The teacher quickly stepped in, grabbed the kid by the arm, and pulled him away from the group. The other children helped me stand up, brushing the sawdust off my clothes and asking if I was okay. I felt a little dizzy, but otherwise fine. No one seemed eager to explain what had happened, though. Later that day, I found the same kid again and asked him about it. I wanted to know what he meant when he said I floated. This time his reaction was completely different. He avoided eye contact, shrugged, and said that I had just fallen off the bridge. Then he walked away and didn't want to talk about it anymore. When I tried asking the other kids, none of them gave a clear answer either. Even the teacher never explained what had happened. To this day, I still don't know exactly what occurred in those missing moments. Maybe I briefly blacked out and fell. Maybe I slipped and someone moved me away from the structure before I realized what happened. It's even possible that my memory simply skipped over the moment of falling. The most likely explanation is something simple like that. Still, what has always stuck with me is how vivid those two moments are. I clearly remember standing on the bridge looking out toward the field, and I clearly remember lying on the ground afterward with people standing over me. Everything in between is just gone. The next strange memory happened years later, when my family spent a year living in Sri Lanka. My father worked for the State Department, and because of his job, we occasionally lived in different places around the world. During that year, I rode a school bus every morning through busy streets lined with small shops and market stands. The streets were always full of people selling fruit, vegetables, clothing, and all kinds of everyday items. It was a colorful and lively place, and I often liked to sit by the window on the bus so I could watch everything as we passed by. One morning, traffic was moving especially slowly. Because of that, I had plenty of time to look carefully at each little shop we drove past. I remember leaning against the bus window and spacing out while watching the activity outside. As we passed one small fruit stand, I saw a man standing next to a cart full of oranges. He picked up 2 oranges from the cart and tossed them lightly into the air, almost like he was about to start juggling. Then something happened that has stayed with me ever since. The oranges didn't come back down. They just hung there, in the air. The man stepped backward slightly while the oranges remained floating above the cart, as if time had paused for them. It only lasted a moment before the bus moved forward and the scene disappeared from view. I remember sitting there quietly afterward, Anna trying to process what I had just seen. I thought about telling someone when I got to school, but I quickly realized that no one would believe me. Even I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. So I never said anything about it. Even now, I still wonder if I somehow misinterpreted what I saw, or if there was a trick of perspective or timing that made it appear that way. The last story isn't something that happened directly to me, but to my wife when we were younger. In the winter of 2008, I had surgery on my back to remove a pilonidal cyst. At the time I was in college, but because the surgery happened during winter break, I stayed at my parents' house for a few days to recover. My girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, stayed with me the first night after the surgery to make sure I was okay. I slept on an air mattress in the living room, while she slept on the couch next to me. I had taken pain medication and wasn't feeling great, so most of that evening is a bit fuzzy for me. I remember us watching television until around 11 at night, before I started drifting off to sleep. After that, I passed out pretty quickly. The layout of the living room was simple. The couch faced the hallway that led to the bedrooms and the bathroom. To the right of the couch was a large picture window that looked out toward the west. My parents were sleeping in one of the bedrooms down the hallway, and my little sister, who was about 5 years old at the time, was in the other. Sometime in the middle of the night, my girlfriend woke up suddenly with a strong sense of dread. She later described it as the feeling that someone was watching her. The room wasn't completely dark because a light outside the large window cast a soft glow across the living room. The hallway itself was dimly lit by that same light, just enough to make out shapes. She looked around the room, trying to understand why she felt so uneasy. At first, nothing happened. Then she saw something that completely froze her in place. 2 figures seemed to pass through the window and drift into the hallway. She described them as dark, charcoal-colored shapes that looked slightly cloudy, almost like shadows mixed with smoke. They moved slowly down the hallway towards the bedrooms. When they reached the end of the hall, they stopped. One of the figures remained there while the other turned and started moving toward the living room where I was sleeping. My girlfriend said she felt completely frozen as she watched it approach. As it moved closer, she began noticing more details. The cloudy shape seemed to wrap around something beneath it, almost like a cloak or shroud. Underneath that shadowy covering, she thought she could see a pale skeletal face and thin, pale hands. The figure moved in a strange way, almost like it was half floating and half crawling across the floor. When it reached my air mattress, it hovered above me for a moment. Then it turned toward my girlfriend. She said she felt an intense cold sensation spread through her body, starting from her feet and slowly moving upward toward her neck. The figure drifted toward her and extended one of its pale hands as if it was about to touch her shoulder. Just before it could reach her, my little sister quietly called out her name. At that moment, both figures disappeared instantly. My sister was standing nearby, asking if someone could help her get a glass of milk. Apparently, she had been calling my girlfriend's name for about a minute before she finally noticed her. My girlfriend got up and helped her, then came back to check on me. When she placed her hand on my forehead, she realized I was burning up with a fever. I vaguely remember waking up for a moment when she touched my head. Shortly afterward, I felt intense nausea and rushed to the bathroom to throw up, most likely because of the medication or the anesthesia from surgery. My girlfriend didn't sleep at all for the rest of that night. The next morning, she told me everything she had seen. A A few days later, she began searching online for stories that sounded similar to what she had experienced. Eventually, she came across something called the Sluagh, spirits from certain folklore that were said to enter homes through west-facing windows and carry away souls. After reading that, she became convinced that I had been extremely ill that night and that something had almost taken me. Personally, I think it was more likely that she experienced a form of sleep paralysis or a waking dream brought on by fear and exhaustion. Still, I have to admit, something about that night has always unsettled me. My wife has never been someone who scares easily, and that was the first and only time I have ever seen her truly terrified by something she witnessed. Even though I lean toward a logical explanation, a small part of me still wonders what really happened that night. It happened during my university exam period one winter, a time that already felt stressful and exhausting. Anyone who has been through that stage of education knows how intense it can be. Your days blur together as you sit for hours surrounded by textbooks, notes, and empty coffee mugs, trying to absorb as much information as possible before the next exam arrives. Your mind is constantly racing, and even when you take breaks, you still feel the pressure sitting quietly in the back of your thoughts. That evening, I had decided to study in my room upstairs. It was the quietest place in the house, and I could focus better there without distractions. My desk was covered with open books, highlighters, and scattered pages of handwritten notes. I had been studying for hours already, reading the same chapters again and again. Trying to make sure I understood everything before the test. The house was completely empty. My dad was supposed to still be at work, and my mom and sister had gone into the city to watch a play together. That meant I had the entire house to myself for the evening, which normally would have been the perfect situation for studying. Outside, winter had already settled in fully. The daylight disappeared early that time of year, and by the late afternoon, the sky had already started turning dark. Rain had begun falling earlier in the day, and by the time evening arrived, it was coming down steadily. The sound of rain tapping against the roof and windows filled the background of the house. Rain has a strange effect on the world outside. It softens everything. Distant sounds become muffled, and the atmosphere feels heavier and quieter. From my room upstairs, I could hear the rain clearly, along with the occasional creak of the house settling as older homes tend to do when temperatures shift. To help myself focus, I had music playing through my headphones. The music was quiet enough that I could still think while I studied, but loud enough to block out the constant sound of rain. Our house was located near a large stretch of bushland that blended directly into our backyard. It wasn't an official park, more like a wild, natural area that had never been fully cleared. Trees, thick shrubs, and uneven paths filled the space behind our house. During the daytime, it could be a peaceful place to walk or sit quietly, but at night it became dark and dense, almost like a wall of shadow beyond the edge of the yard. Not too far away, there was also a train station. If someone really wanted to, they could leave the station and push through the bush area until they reached the houses along our street. It wasn't something I usually thought about, but technically the possibility was there. That evening, though, my mind was focused only on studying. I was leaning over my desk, highlighting sections in my notes while listening to music and trying to memorize key information. I had been working like that for quite a while when something unexpected happened. One of the songs in my playlist ended. For a brief moment, there was silence before the next song started. In that short gap, I heard a sound from downstairs. It was faint at first, but it sounded like a sudden bang followed by movement. I froze instantly and pulled my headphones off. The sound had come from somewhere on the lower floor of the house. For a few seconds, everything went quiet again, and I sat there trying to convince myself that maybe I had imagined it. Old houses make strange noises all the time. Wood expands and contracts, pipes shift, and sometimes the wind pushes against doors or windows in strange ways. But then I heard it again. Footsteps. They were slow and heavy. The sound moved across the hardwood floor downstairs. When you live with the same people for many years, you become very familiar with how they move around the house. Without even seeing them, you can recognize their footsteps. You know how your parents walk, how your siblings move, and even how their steps sound on certain parts of the floor. The footsteps I was hearing were not familiar. Each step landed with a dull, solid thump. They sounded heavier than normal, almost like someone wearing thick work boots. And with every step there was another small sound that made my stomach tighten with anxiety. It sounded like little pieces of mud falling from the boots and hitting the hardwood floor. The noise was clear enough that I couldn't mistake it. My entire body tensed immediately. A rush of fear ran through me as my mind quickly started going through possibilities. My dad wasn't supposed to be home yet, and even if he was, his footsteps didn't sound like that. My mom and sister were definitely still at the play in the city. That left only one explanation. Someone else might be inside the house. Slowly, I stood up from my chair, trying not to make any noise. My room was located at the top of the staircase, and from there I could hear sounds from the lower level very clearly. I stepped quietly toward the top of the stairs. Every movement felt tense because my heart was now beating hard in my chest. I focused all my attention on the sounds coming from below. The footsteps continued, slow, heavy, unfamiliar. Standing there at the top of the staircase, I listened carefully while trying to understand what was happening. My mind kept returning to the bushland behind our house. If someone had walked through that overgrown reserve, they could easily reach the backyard and enter through the back door. The thought made my stomach twist. My heart was pounding so loudly that I could almost hear it in my ears. My hands clenched into fists without me even realizing it. In that moment, I made a decision. Instead of staying quiet or hiding in my room, I wanted whoever was downstairs to know that someone was home. I took a deep breath and shouted down the staircase as loudly as I could, "Go away! There is someone here!" My voice echoed through the house. The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt incredibly heavy. It was the kind of silence that makes your entire body tense because you're waiting for the next sound. For a moment I stood there completely still, listening. Nothing moved. I slowly began walking down the stairs. My fists were still raised slightly, as if I was somehow preparing to defend myself. Even though I had no idea what I would actually do if someone was really down there. Each step down the staircase felt uncertain, but I kept moving forward. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I cautiously stepped into the hallway where I had last heard the footsteps. And then I saw him, standing there in the hallway. Soaked from head to toe was my father. His jacket and clothes were dripping with rainwater. His boots were completely covered in mud, and small clumps of wet dirt were scattered across the hardwood floor around his feet. In that moment, everything made sense. He had come home early from work and walked through the bush reserve behind our house to get there faster. The rain had turned the ground into thick mud, which explained the heavy footsteps and the sound of dirt falling from his boots. For a second, I just stood there staring at him, my brain trying to catch up with what was happening. All the fear that had been building inside me suddenly drained away. I still didn't understand why he hadn't answered when I shouted from upstairs. Maybe he hadn't heard me clearly because of the rain outside. Maybe he was distracted or tired after work. Whatever the reason, his unexpected arrival had completely terrified me. The moment I realized it was him, my body finally relaxed. The tension that had been locked in my chest slowly faded. I walked over to him and gave him a hug. still feeling the leftover adrenaline from believing someone had broken into the house. My father looked slightly confused about why I seemed so shaken after Your mind naturally jumps to the worst possible explanation. In the end, it turned out to be nothing more than my father coming home early and choosing an unusual route through the bushland behind our house. But in those few minutes before I knew the truth, it felt like one of the most frightening moments I had ever experienced in my own home. Even now, years later, whenever I hear unexpected footsteps in a quiet house, that memory instantly comes rushing back. I was about 12 years old when this happened. At the time, it didn't feel like anything especially important. It was just a small moment during a normal childhood sleepover. But as the years went by, the memory stayed with me. Some memories from childhood fade or become fuzzy, but this one has remained strangely clear. Even now, when I think back on it, I can still picture the room, the kittens, and the brief moment when I saw the person walking away from my bed. I had gone over to a friend's house to spend the night. We were both excited the way kids usually are when they get the chance to stay somewhere other than their own home. Sleepovers always felt like a little adventure. It meant staying up later than we normally would, whispering about random things, laughing at jokes that probably weren't even funny, and enjoying that feeling of freedom that came with being away from your own bedroom for the night. My friend's house had a lively and comfortable feeling to it. It was the kind of home where things were always happening and where there was always some background noise or activity going on. One of the biggest things happening in the house at that time was that their cat had recently had a litter of kittens. They were still very young, only a few weeks old, and they had just started exploring the house. Those kittens were full of energy. Throughout the evening, my friend and I spent a lot of time playing with them. Anyone who has been around young kittens knows how entertaining they can be. They tumble over each other while trying to run, pounce on anything that moves, and act like everything in the world is a toy meant for them. We watched them chase bits of string across the floor. Sometimes they would try to climb up onto furniture and then awkwardly tumble back down. They were clumsy, curious, and endlessly playful. For kids our age, it was impossible not to be entertained by them. Eventually, the evening wound down, and it was time for us to go to sleep. We headed into the room where we were going to spend the night. The lights were turned off, and the house slowly grew quieter as everyone settled down. But the kittens had no intention of settling down. Not long after I had laid down and tried to get comfortable, 4 of the tiny kittens somehow managed to climb up onto the bed. At first it seemed harmless. They wandered across the blankets, stepping lightly with their little paws. Their paws tickled as they walked across the covers. One kitten crawled near my arm, while another one bounced across my legs. At first it made me laugh a little. They were so small and harmless that it didn't seem like a big problem. But as the minutes passed, the novelty started to wear off. Every time I tried to relax and fall asleep, one of them would step directly on me. Another would climb up toward my shoulder or chase one of its siblings across the blankets. They were constantly moving, constantly curious, and completely uninterested in letting anyone sleep. It felt like they had unlimited energy. I gently pushed them away a few times, hoping they might wander off somewhere else in the room. But it didn't work. They always seemed to find their way back onto the bed. One would curl up near my feet, while another would climb up toward my pillow. Eventually, I was lying there in that half-awake state where you're extremely tired but still aware of what's happening around you. I remember feeling exhausted and slightly annoyed at the tiny swarm of kittens bouncing around on the blankets. That's when I heard the door open. The sound was soft and quiet, just the gentle movement of the door being pushed open. Then I heard the faint sound of footsteps crossing the floor. At that moment, I was too tired to think much about it. My first thought was that it must be my friend's mom coming in. Maybe she had heard the noise from the kittens running around, or noticed that they had wandered into the room. The person who entered walked over toward the bed. One by one, the kittens began disappearing from the blankets. I could feel the small weight of each kitten being lifted away. The bed slowly became still and quiet again as each of them was picked up. In my tired state, the main thing I felt was relief. Finally, the bed was peaceful again. I rolled slightly onto my side and mumbled a quiet thanks, assuming it was my friend's mom who had come to rescue me from the restless kittens. For a brief moment, I turned my head and looked back toward the doorway. That was when I saw the person who had taken the kittens. It was a woman. She was already walking away from the bed, carrying the kittens with her toward the door. I didn't see her face clearly because her back was turned as she moved toward the hallway, but I noticed a few details. She was tall and thin, and she had long, dark hair that reached down her back. At the time, my brain didn't question it much. I was tired and ready to sleep, and I assumed it was simply an adult in the house helping out. Still, even in that short glance, something about it didn't quite match up. My friend's mom was short, and she had blonde hair. The woman I had just seen was tall with long, dark hair. But I was already drifting back toward sleep. My mind probably brushed the detail aside, assuming I had misseen something because I was half asleep. Within moments, I rolled back over and finally fell asleep. The rest of the night passed normally. The next morning, sunlight came through the windows and filled the room. Everything felt normal again, the way mornings usually do after a night of sleep. The house had that calm, quiet feeling that homes often have early in the day. My friend and I got out of bed and started moving around the house. Eventually, we made our way toward the kitchen. A little while later, the front door opened. My friend's mom walked in. She looked tired, like someone who had just finished working overnight. She was still wearing her work uniform and carrying her things as she stepped into the house. Seeing her reminded me of the moment from the night before. Without thinking too much about it, I casually thanked her. I said something like, "Thanks for coming in last night and taking the kittens off my bed." She stopped and looked at me with a confused expression. For a second, she didn't respond, like she was trying to figure out what I meant. Then she told me that she hadn't done that. She explained that she had just gotten home from her night shift and hadn't been in the house during the night at all. Hearing that sent a strange chill through me. I tried explaining what I remembered. I told her that someone had come into the room, picked up the kittens, and carried them out. I even described the woman I had seen walking toward the door, but she shook her head and repeated that she hadn't been home. The more we talked about it, the stranger it started to feel. No one else in the house matched the description of the woman I had seen. As far as anyone knew, no other adult had entered the room during the night. For years, I've wondered what actually happened. Maybe I was so tired that my mind filled in details that weren't really there. Maybe someone else in the house briefly came into the room and I misunderstood who it was. Or maybe it was just one of those strange moments when dreams and reality overlap for a second. All I know is that I went to bed with 4 kittens running all over me. Someone came into the room and quietly carried them away. And the next morning, the one person I thought it must have been said she had never even been in the house. I was 20 years old when this happened. At the time, I had moved out to Colorado for the winter to work as a chairlift operator at Beaver Creek Resort. It was one of those seasonal jobs a lot of young people take when they want to experience living near the mountains for a while. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was fun in its own way. Most of us working there were young, living with friends, and enjoying the freedom of being away from home. I was sharing a place with a few friends from high school who had come out there with me. We were all from the Midwest originally, and moving to Colorado together felt like a big adventure at the time. One of my roommates even worked at the same resort as a lift operator, so we spent a lot of time together both on and off the job. One day while I was at the house, the phone rang. This was before everyone relied completely on cell phones, so we still had a regular house phone that people used to call each other. I picked it up and heard my roommate on the other end. Right away, I could tell something was wrong by the tone of his voice. He told me that Kevin, one of our very close friends back in our hometown, had died. For a moment, I didn't even know how to react. Kevin had been one of our best friends growing up. We had all known each other for years. Hearing something like that so suddenly felt unreal. At first, we didn't even have any details about what had happened. All we knew was that he was gone. The news hit both of us hard. We immediately knew we had to go back home. Being so far away made the situation feel even worse. Our friends and families were all back in the Midwest, and we felt like we needed to be there with everyone during such a difficult time. So we left work early, packed up what we needed, and started the long drive home. It was one of those quiet, heavy road trips where neither of us talked much. Our minds were stuck on the same thought the entire time. We kept wondering what had happened and how something like this could have occurred. When we finally arrived in town, we went straight to our friend Dan's house. Kevin had been living there with him. We figured that was the best place to go because we knew many of our other friends would probably be there too. When we walked in, the house was already full of familiar faces. A lot of our friends had gathered there. Everyone was sitting around talking, remembering Kevin, and trying to make sense of the situation. The mood in the room was heavy, but people were also sharing stories about him. That's something that often happens after someone passes away. People remember the funny moments, the ridiculous things that happened over the years, and all the little memories that made that person special. Eventually, we started hearing more details about what had happened. Apparently, Kevin had been found hanging from a tree at a nearby park, but there was very little information about what led to it. Nobody seemed to know exactly what had happened before that moment. There were more questions than answers, and that uncertainty made everything feel even more disturbing. The hours passed slowly as everyone talked and tried to process the news. At some point, it was around 1 a.m. I was standing in the kitchen with about 6 of my friends. We were just talking quietly. I still sharing stories and trying to support each other. Then suddenly my cell phone rang. I reached into my pocket and pulled it out. When I looked at the screen, my heart nearly stopped. The caller ID said Kevin was calling me. For a moment, I just stared at the phone in disbelief. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. Kevin had died. We had all just spent hours talking about it, yet somehow his name was appearing on my phone as if he were calling. My friends could see the look on my face. I turned the phone around so they could see the screen too. Their reactions were the same as mine. Everyone's eyes widened, and for a few seconds, nobody said a word. It was one of those moments where reality feels like it has suddenly broken. After hesitating for a moment, I answered the phone. I slowly lifted it to my ear. There was nothing but silence. No voice, no sound at all, just empty silence on the other end of the line. After a few seconds, the call ended. The whole thing left me completely shaken. My mind immediately started racing through possibilities. Maybe someone had Kevin's phone. Maybe it had been a glitch. Maybe it was some strange coincidence. But the timing felt incredibly eerie. One thing about Kevin that everyone knew was that he loved pranks. He was the kind of guy who was always messing with people, especially his friends. And for whatever reason, I had always been one of his favorite targets. He would go out of his way to pull little jokes on me whenever he could. Because of that, part of me wondered if there was some kind of explanation involving him setting something up earlier, but at that moment, none of it made sense. Still, as strange as that phone call was, the part that truly shook me happened the next day. It was the night before Kevin's funeral, and I was staying at my parents' house. Since I was back home, I decided to take advantage of the opportunity and do some laundry. My parents' house was old, and the basement had always felt a little creepy. It was one of those unfinished basements with exposed beams and concrete walls, the kind of place that feels colder and darker than the rest of the house. The lighting down there was simple too. Instead of a normal light switch, there was a single bulb hanging from the ceiling that you turned on and off using a pull string. I went downstairs by myself and started moving the laundry from the washing machine to the dryer. While I was doing that, my mind drifted back to memories of Kevin. I found myself thinking about all the ridiculous things we had done growing up and all the times he had made us laugh. After I finished switching the clothes over, I reached up and pulled the string to turn off the light. The bulb clicked off instantly. The basement went completely dark. As I turned toward the stairs to leave, something happened that froze me in place. Right behind my right ear, only inches away, I heard a whisper. "You can't see me now." The voice sounded exactly like Kevin. The moment I heard it, my entire body locked up. It felt like every muscle in my body had turned to stone. My heart started pounding in my chest, and a cold shiver shot straight up my spine. For a few seconds, I couldn't move at all. It felt like that moment stretched forever. My brain was trying desperately to understand what had just happened, but nothing made sense. Then suddenly my body reacted. I bolted for the stairs. I ran up them as fast as I possibly could and burst into the living room where my mom was sitting. I must have looked completely terrified because she immediately asked what was wrong. I tried to explain what had just happened in the basement, but even as I said the words out loud, it sounded unbelievable. I knew how crazy it must have sounded. Nothing like that has ever happened to me again since then. But even now, years later, I still remember that whisper clearly. And knowing Kevin, a part of me still wonders if somehow, in some strange way, he managed to pull one last prank on me. Pardon the interruption for just a moment. I hope these stories are keeping you on the edge of your seat tonight. If you're finding yourself drawn to these dark accounts, I'd love to have you join us. If you're new here, please consider hitting that subscribe button. We share new true horror stories every single day, and being part of the community is the only way to make sure you never miss a nightmare. A quick like and a comment also means a lot. It really helps the shadows spread a little further. But for now, let's get back to it. The darkness is calling. This happened years ago when I was younger, and even though I can explain parts of it now, the memories of those moments still feel strange when I think back on them. None of it was necessarily supernatural, but at the time it was unsettling enough that it stuck with me. I grew up in a town in Central California, and one unusual thing about our location was that we were almost exactly in the middle of 3 large air bases. Because of that, military aircraft flying over the area was not unheard of, but during certain periods, it became much more noticeable. This all took place around the time when the United States was preparing to invade Iraq, during what later became known as the Shock and Awe campaign. In the weeks leading up to that event, the amount of military activity in the skies above our town noticeably increased. It felt like almost every day you could see helicopters passing overhead, especially Apache helicopters. The sound of their rotors chopping through the air became a familiar background noise for a while. At the time, I didn't think much about it beyond noticing that something unusual was happening. Later on, when I thought about the timing of the strange events I experienced, I always wondered whether some of them might have been related to military testing or operations happening around the nearby bases. I've never been able to confirm that for certain, but the timing always seemed to line up. One of the strangest things happened one afternoon while I was downtown with my dad. It was around midday, and we were just walking along the street running errands like we normally did. The day itself was bright and clear with plenty of sunlight, and everything felt perfectly normal. At one point, I happened to glance down at the ground and noticed my shadow stretching out on the pavement beside me. Something about it looked strange. The light around it seemed to have a faint greenish tint. At first I thought maybe it was just my imagination or maybe some reflection from a nearby window. I mentioned it to my dad, pointing down and asking if he noticed anything odd about the light. He looked at the ground for a moment, but before we could really talk about it, something dramatic happened. Suddenly the entire sky flashed bright. It was an incredibly intense burst of light, far brighter than normal daylight. The brightness was so strong that I had to shield my eyes with my hand because it felt like staring directly into something blinding. For a brief moment, everything around us seemed to glow. Then, almost immediately after that burst of brightness, the opposite happened. The entire area suddenly went dim, almost like dusk had arrived instantly in the middle of the day. The change in light was dramatic and confusing. One moment everything was glowing white with brightness, and the next moment it felt as if evening had suddenly fallen over the street. The strange shift lasted only a few seconds before the lighting returned to normal as if nothing had happened. The whole event probably lasted somewhere between 5 and 10 seconds, but in those few seconds, everyone around us reacted. I remember looking around and seeing people on the street crouching down or ducking behind things. Some people started running for cover, probably because they had no idea what had just happened. When something that's sudden and intense occurs without warning, people naturally assume the worst. What made the situation even stranger was that when we all looked up afterward, the sky looked completely normal. There were no aircraft visible overhead, no explosions, no smoke, nothing at all to explain the flash of light. It was just gone. Even now, I still think about that moment sometimes. I have wondered whether it might have been some kind of high-altitude test or atmospheric event connected to military activity nearby. But at the time, standing on that street and seeing the sky behave like that for a few seconds was extremely unsettling. Another strange thing happened around that same time period. One day, I was walking out into our driveway to grab something from the car. It was a normal afternoon, and everything seemed quiet. As I stepped outside, I heard a sound coming from somewhere in the distance. It was a strange, metallic whining noise. The sound was hard to describe. It wasn't like the roar of a normal airplane engine. Instead, it had this sharp, mechanical tone that grew louder as it approached. Curious, I looked up into the sky to see what was making the noise. That's when I saw something fly over the house. The object looked unusual right away. It wasn't shaped like a regular airplane, at least not the ones I was used to seeing. It had a long, narrow shape that reminded me more of a torpedo or missile. There were wings attached to it, but the overall design looked very different from typical aircraft. It moved quickly across the sky, low enough that I could clearly see details on its surface. I could actually see markings and labels printed on the side of it as it passed overhead. That's how close it was. The object wasn't huge like a commercial plane, but it definitely wasn't small either. It looked roughly the size of a small sedan, which made it far larger than any remote-controlled aircraft. Before I had time to process what I was seeing, it was already gone. The metallic whine faded as it disappeared into the distance. I remember standing there in the driveway wondering what in the world had just flown over my house. At the time, I assumed it must have been some kind of military drone or experimental aircraft connected to one of the nearby bases. But again, I never found any confirmation. The final experience happened later that year during the summer after shock and awe had already begun. That one is probably the most intense memory of the three. My grandparents had taken my brother and me on a trip down to Los Angeles. We spent some time there visiting places around the city, and eventually it was time to drive back north toward home. We left later in the evening and were driving through the Grapevine area sometime around 10 or 11 at night. If you've ever traveled through that region, you know it's a long stretch of highway, winding through hills and mountains. At night, the area can feel very dark and isolated except for the headlights of cars moving along the road. At one point during the drive, I noticed something unusual in the sky ahead of us. It looked like a bright star at first, but the light slowly began to grow larger. At first, it reminded me of the lights on an approaching airplane. When a plane is flying towards you from far away, its lights often appear small at first, and then gradually grow brighter. But this light kept getting bigger and bigger. Soon it was far brighter than any airplane light I had ever seen. As we watched, the glowing point expanded into a massive ball of light hanging in the sky. The brightness pulsed and shimmered in a way that made it look almost alive with energy. The light grew so intense that it began casting shadows across the hills and foothills around the highway. Then something even stranger happened. From the center of that glowing mass, a brilliant green light suddenly burst outward. Right after that came a ring of pale, shimmering light that expanded outward incredibly fast. The ring spread across the sky like a ripple moving across water. It moved so quickly that it seemed to race outward in every direction at once. Within seconds, the entire formation expanded into a huge, glowing fireball of light that looked impossibly large, almost like a miniature sun suspended above the horizon. Cars on the highway began slowing down. Many drivers pulled their vehicles over to the side of the road. People got out of their cars and stood staring at the sky. At that moment, nobody knew what we were looking at. Considering the time period and the fact that the country had just entered a war, many people probably thought we were witnessing some kind of attack or catastrophic event. For a 14-year-old kid sitting in the car, it was terrifying. The glowing mass remained in the sky for a long time afterward, shimmering and slowly fading but still visible. It seemed to hover there for close to an hour before gradually dissipating. Later on, I learned that what we probably witnessed was some kind of missile test or explosion from a nearby military base. Once I heard that explanation, the visuals started to make a lot more sense. But at the time, we had no idea what it was. These events all happened before smartphones existed, so nobody had cameras ready to capture things instantly, the way people do today. Looking back, I realized that parts of the story probably sound unbelievable. But at the time, those moments were very real and very intense. Even if there are logical explanations for most of them now, experiencing those things as a teenager made them feel incredibly mysterious and frightening. And even today, when I think back on those strange flashes in the sky and the unusual aircraft flying overhead, I still remember how surreal it all felt at the time. This happened many years ago, but it is still one of the strangest nights I can clearly remember. I have told this story a few times before when people were sharing unexplained experiences, and every time I tell it, I still get the same uneasy feeling I had that night. Some memories fade over time, but certain moments stick with you because of how intense they felt when they happened. That night was one of those moments. It was sometime around 1 a.m. My brother and I were both awake, even though we probably should have been asleep. We were sitting at my computer in my room, doing what kids often did back then late at night when the house was quiet. I think we were reading things online about Pokemon or something similar. We were just casually browsing and talking, not really paying attention to anything else around us. So the house felt completely normal and peaceful. Our parents were asleep in their bedroom down the hall, and the rest of the neighborhood outside was quiet, like most streets are in the middle of the night. The only light in the room was coming from the computer screen, which made the rest of the house feel even darker by comparison. Everything felt calm and ordinary. There was nothing unusual happening at all. If someone had asked me at that moment whether anything strange was about to happen, I would have laughed. Then suddenly, everything changed. Without any warning, we heard our parents' bedroom door shake violently. It wasn't a gentle movement or the kind of noise you get when someone bumps into a door by accident. It sounded like the door had been hit or rattled with force. The noise echoed through the hallway and immediately grabbed our attention. Before we could even react to that sound, something else happened. From somewhere outside the house came the most horrifying scream I have ever heard in my entire life. It wasn't just a normal scream like someone shouting or calling for help. It was long, raw, and filled with so much emotion that it made my entire body freeze. The sound carried through the quiet night air and seemed to cut through the walls of the house. It had a quality that is very difficult to describe. It sounded like pure panic and grief mixed together, almost like someone was experiencing unbearable pain or terror. The moment I heard it, a deep feeling of dread rushed over me. It was one of those instinctive reactions where your body responds before your mind has time to process what is happening. My brother and I both looked at each other with the same shocked expression. Neither of us said a word, but we both knew that something was terribly wrong. We immediately ran out of my room and down the hallway toward our parents' bedroom. Whatever had just happened clearly had something to do with the noise we heard from their door, and we needed to see what was going on. When we burst into the room, we found my mother in complete panic. She looked absolutely terrified. My dad was awake too, and although he looked shaken, he seemed more focused on making sure my mom was okay. The scream had clearly woken them up as well. My mother kept asking if anyone else had heard it. Her voice was shaky, and she looked genuinely frightened. My dad tried to calm her down, but it was obvious that he had heard the same thing we did. The scream had been so loud and disturbing that it was impossible to ignore. All of us rushed toward the window that looked out onto the street in front of our house. The neighborhood was normally very quiet at night. Streetlights cast a soft glow over the pavement, and most houses were completely dark because everyone was asleep. As we looked outside, we quickly spotted the source of the sound. Walking slowly down the street was a young woman dressed in white. Even from a distance, we could see that she looked distressed. Her movements were slow and unsteady, and every few moments she would let out another heartbreaking sob. Occasionally, those sobs would turn into the same terrifying scream we had heard earlier. The sound echoed through the empty street in a way that made the entire scene feel surreal. The woman kept walking forward slowly, almost as if she were in some kind of trance. She didn't appear to be looking at anything around her. Her posture was slightly hunched, and she seemed completely consumed by whatever emotions were overwhelming her. At first, our immediate reaction was concern. Seeing someone in that state in the middle of the night made it seem like she might be in serious danger or distress. My dad didn't hesitate for long. He quickly decided to go outside and see if she needed help. While my brother, my mother, and I watched nervously from the window, my dad stepped outside and approached her. He called out to her and asked if she was okay. He asked if she needed help or if someone had hurt her. But something strange happened. The woman did not respond at all. She didn't turn her head. She didn't slow down. She didn't even seem to notice that my dad was standing there talking to her. She just kept walking forward down the street. Every so often she would let out another chilling scream that echoed into the night. The sound made my skin crawl. Even from inside the house, I could see the look on my dad's face change as he realized something about the situation wasn't normal. He stood there for a moment trying again to speak to her, asking if she needed help, but the result was exactly the same. It was as if she couldn't see or hear him at all. Eventually, my dad slowly backed away and came back inside the house. I will never forget the expression on his face when he walked through the door. It was a mixture of confusion and fear. He clearly didn't understand what had just happened. Once he was back inside, he decided the best thing to do was call the police. Even though the woman had ignored him, it still seemed possible that she might be in danger or experiencing some kind of emergency. He explained to the police what we had seen and heard, describing the woman walking down the street screaming and crying. The police said they would check the area. After that, the house felt strangely quiet again. My family stayed awake for a long time, talking about what had just happened. None of us could fully explain why the woman had acted that way, or why she completely ignored my dad when he tried to help her. The next day, we expected to hear something about it. We assumed the police would have found her somewhere nearby, but when we asked about it, the answer was surprising. According to the police, they had searched the area and found no evidence of the woman at all. No one matching that description had been located anywhere nearby. None of the neighbors reported seeing her. There were no signs that anyone had been wandering the streets in distress that night. It was as if she had simply disappeared. Over the years, people who have heard the story often suggest different explanations. Some think she might have been a sleepwalker or someone experiencing a mental health crisis. Others believe it could have been someone under the influence of something or dealing with extreme emotional trauma. But some people bring up older legends. Because of where I live, not far from the Mexican border, several people have mentioned the legend of La Llorona. In Mexican folklore, La Llorona is said to be the spirit of a grieving woman who wanders at night crying and searching for her lost children. Stories about her often describe hearing a woman weeping or screaming in the distance. Of course, I don't claim that is what we saw, but I will say this. That scream was unlike anything I have ever heard before or since. And even now, years later, I still sometimes think back to that night and wonder who that woman was, why she ignored my dad completely, and how the police somehow found no trace of her at all. I was about 10 or 11 years old when this happened. At that time, my family had a routine that meant my sister and I sometimes spent the evening at home by ourselves. My mother worked at a dental clinic that was about an hour away from our house, and my dad would drive out to pick her up when her shift ended. Because of traffic and the distance, the whole trip usually took him close to 2 hours. On nights like that, my older sister and I stayed home until they returned. It was one of those evenings that felt completely normal at first. My sister and I had done it many times before, so we weren't particularly nervous about being alone. The house felt quiet but comfortable, the way it usually does once night settles in, and most people in the neighborhood are inside. I remember it was around 8 o'clock at night. The sky outside had already gone dark, and the lights inside the house gave everything a warm glow. I was downstairs in the kitchen area, eating something small. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was probably something quick and simple, like a snack or leftovers from dinner. My sister was in the living room, which was connected to the main part of the house. She was older than me and usually acted like she was completely calm about staying home alone. She sat on the sofa watching television, relaxed and not worried about anything. Our house had a staircase that went from the main floor up to the second floor where the bedrooms were. As you walked toward the stairs, you passed by a door that led into another room. That room connected to both the garage and the basement area. Now, it was one of those parts of the house that always felt a little darker and quieter than the rest. During the daytime, it was just another room, but at night it sometimes felt different, especially for a kid. After I finished eating, I started walking toward the stairs to go upstairs. I don't remember exactly why I was heading up there. Maybe I wanted to grab something from my room, or maybe I was just bored and wandering around the house. Everything felt normal at that moment. As I stepped onto the first few stairs, I suddenly heard a voice. It came from behind me, somewhere near the room that led toward the garage and basement. The voice said very clearly, "Well, hello." What made it so terrifying wasn't just the words themselves. It was the way the voice sounded. It was incredibly deep, much deeper than any voice I had ever heard before. It had a rough, heavy tone that felt almost unnatural to me at the time. To my 10-year-old ears, it sounded almost demonic, like something out of a horror movie. For a second, my brain froze. When you're that young, your mind immediately jumps to the worst possibilities. I knew my parents weren't home, and my sister was in the living room behind me. The voice definitely hadn't come from her. That meant someone else was inside the house. The realization hit me all at once. I remember feeling a rush of fear shoot through my entire body. My heart started racing so fast that it felt like it was pounding in my ears. I didn't stop to look behind me or try to see who had spoken. Instinct took over. I ran up the stairs faster than I had ever moved in my life. My feet practically flew up those steps. I remember stumbling a little because I was going so fast, but I didn't stop. I just kept running until I reached the top and rushed into the living room area where my sister was sitting. She was still on the sofa watching television and completely unaware that anything strange had just happened. I dove behind the sofa where she was sitting, trying to hide while I caught my breath. My sister turned around immediately, confused by my sudden panic. She asked what was wrong, and I told her that I had heard a man's voice downstairs. At first she didn't believe me. She probably thought I was imagining things or trying to scare her, but I kept insisting that someone had spoken. I told her exactly what I had heard. I explained how deep and creepy the voice sounded and that it came from the direction of the room near the basement and garage. The more I described it, the more serious she started to look. Suddenly, the house didn't feel so normal anymore. Both of us became very quiet, listening carefully for any sounds from downstairs. When you're scared like that, every little noise seems amplified. The house creaked softly in places, and each sound made our nerves jump. We realized that if someone really was inside the house, we needed help. That's when we decided to call 911. I remember feeling nervous while making the call, even though I had been taught that calling emergency services was the right thing to do in dangerous situations. Actually doing it felt very serious. My voice probably sounded shaky as I explained that we were home alone and believed someone might have broken into the house. The operator stayed calm and told us that police officers were on their way. Those next few minutes felt incredibly long. My sister and I stayed upstairs, listening carefully and trying not to make any noise. We were too scared to go downstairs to check anything ourselves. Eventually, we saw flashing lights outside through the windows. Police officers arrived at the house and carefully came inside. They asked us what had happened, and we explained everything from the moment I heard the voice on the stairs. The officers told us to stay where we were while they searched the house. Watching them move through the house was both frightening and reassuring at the same time. They checked every room carefully, making sure no one was hiding anywhere. When they went down into the basement area, they quickly discovered something that explained everything. There were several smashed beer bottles scattered across the basement floor. The officers also noticed that a basement window had been opened. It turned out that someone had broken into the house through that window. The person had apparently been sneaking into houses in the area, looking for alcohol. According to the officers, it was likely a homeless man who had been breaking into basements and garages to steal beer or other drinks people kept stored there. When I heard that explanation, the deep voice suddenly made sense. That man must have been down in the basement when I walked near the stairs. When he said, "Well, hello," he was probably trying to scare me or maybe just reacting to hearing someone in the house. Either way, it was terrifying. The police officers later found and arrested the man after investigating the break-ins around the neighborhood. It turned out he had been entering several houses in the same way, through basement windows. After that night, my parents took extra precautions to make sure nothing like that could happen again. They installed strong locks on all the windows and made sure everything was secured before leaving the house. For a while after the incident, my sister and I were much more aware of every little sound in the house. Looking back now, the situation was very real and very serious. At the time, it felt like something out of a nightmare hearing that voice when I thought we were alone. But in the end, it had a clear explanation. Still, I never forgot how that deep voice sounded when it said those two words from the darkness downstairs. "Well, hello." My mother told me this story many years ago, and even though she always spoke about it calmly, there was something about the way she described that night that made the whole experience feel unsettling. It happened when she was younger, during the time she was studying abroad in England. She had gone there as part of a university program and spent several months living in different places while traveling and attending classes. England was new to her then, and she often talked about how fascinating it felt to be surrounded by buildings and towns that were hundreds of years old. Everything there seemed to carry pieces of history. One evening during that time, she and one of her friends needed a place to stay while traveling between cities. They ended up booking a room at an older hotel. From what she described, it wasn't a fancy modern hotel, but rather one of those historic buildings that had probably been around for a very long time. The kind of place with thick walls, narrow hallways, creaky floors, and furniture that looked like it had been there for decades. The building had character, but it also had that quiet, slightly eerie atmosphere that old places sometimes carry. They checked in sometime in the evening after a long day of travel. Both of them were tired from moving around all day, and once they got to their room, they mostly just wanted to rest. The room itself wasn't particularly large, but it was comfortable enough. There were two separate beds, a small table, and a window looking out over the quiet street below. The furniture looked old but well maintained, and the lighting in the room was soft and warm. They spent a little time talking about their plans for the next day before eventually getting ready for sleep. My mother always mentioned that the hotel felt very quiet once night came. The walls seemed thick, and there weren't many other sounds coming from the rest of the building. After turning off the lights, the room fell into that deep nighttime silence that sometimes happens in older buildings. At some point in the middle of the night, my mother woke up suddenly. She wasn't sure what had caused her to wake up. Sometimes when you sleep in an unfamiliar place, your mind stays slightly more alert than usual. Even small changes in sound or movement can pull you out of sleep. When she opened her eyes, she had an immediate feeling that something was different in the room. For a moment she stayed still, trying to understand why she had woken up. The room was dimly lit by faint light coming through the window. It wasn't completely dark, but the shapes in the room were mostly shadows. Then she noticed something that made her freeze. Standing beside her bed was a woman. My mother said the figure was leaning slightly over her, close enough that she could clearly see the shape of the person standing there. The woman appeared to be wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress, something that didn't resemble modern clothing. It had the kind of style that reminded her of clothing from much earlier periods in history. For a moment, my mother didn't move. She was half awake, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The woman wasn't speaking, and she wasn't making any sudden movements. Instead, she was gently running her fingers through my mother's hair. My mother described the sensation clearly. She said she could actually feel it, the slow motion of fingers moving through her hair, as if someone was calmly brushing it aside. The movement wasn't rough or threatening. It was slow, almost careful. Still, the situation was deeply unsettling. Being in a strange place, waking up suddenly and finding someone standing over your bed is enough to make anyone panic. But my mother said that in that moment she felt more confused than anything else. Her mind was racing through possibilities. Maybe it was a hotel employee. Maybe someone had entered the room by mistake. Maybe she was still partly dreaming. She stayed still for several seconds, watching the figure. The woman didn't say anything. She simply stood there, I quietly moving her fingers through my mother's hair. Eventually, my mother's fear started to grow stronger. She didn't know how long the moment lasted, but she said it felt like a long time. At some point, she must have either fallen back asleep or closed her eyes, because the next thing she clearly remembers is waking up again later in the morning. When daylight filled the room, everything looked completely normal. There was no woman standing beside the bed. The room looked exactly the way it had the night before. For a moment, my mother wondered if the entire experience had been a dream. The human mind can create very vivid dreams, especially when someone is sleeping in an unfamiliar place. Still feeling uneasy, she looked over toward the other bed where her friend had been sleeping. Before my mother could even say anything, her friend spoke first. Her friend asked very seriously if my mother had noticed anything strange during the night. That question immediately caught my mother's attention. She asked what she meant. Her friend hesitated for a moment before explaining that she had woken up during the night and thought she saw a woman standing near my mother's bed. According to her friend, the woman was wearing an old-style dress and seemed to be leaning over slightly. Hearing that made my mother feel a sudden chill. Up until that moment, she had assumed what she experienced might have been a dream or a strange half-sleeping moment. But now someone else was describing the same thing. Both of them became quiet for a few seconds, trying to process what they had just realized. They began comparing details of what they had seen. The descriptions matched surprisingly well. Both remembered the old-fashioned dress. Both remembered the woman standing close to the bed. Naturally, their next thought was that someone must have entered the room during the night. They quickly got up and checked the door, but the door was still locked from the inside. That made the situation even stranger. Hotel rooms are usually secure, and the door had been locked the entire time. There was no sign that anyone had opened it during the night. The windows were closed, and there were no other ways someone could have entered or left the room. The two of them looked around the room again, but there was nothing unusual to find. Eventually, they left the hotel and continued their travels. But the experience stayed in my mother's memory. She never tried to claim that it was definitely something supernatural. Over the years, she mentioned that it might have been some strange shared dream or a trick of the mind. But the fact that both of them described seeing the same woman at the same time made it difficult to explain. Even now, whenever she tells the story, she still wonders about that night in the old English hotel. Whether it was a strange coincidence, a shared moment of imagination, or something else entirely, she never found a clear answer. All she knows is that she woke up in the middle of the night and saw a woman in an old-fashioned dress standing beside her bed, quietly running her fingers through her hair. And somehow, her friend saw the same woman too. Reading stories like that late at night can really make your thoughts run wild, especially if you are already someone who tends to overthink things. When the world around you becomes quiet and your brain has nothing else to focus on, it naturally starts filling in the gaps. A strange sound, a shadow moving across the wall, or a small noise outside the window can suddenly feel much more important than it really is. Your mind begins searching for explanations, and because you just read something creepy, your brain leans toward the most unsettling possibilities. Our brains are wired to notice potential danger. It's a survival instinct that humans have always had. When we read or hear about frightening experiences, that instinct switches on and our senses become sharper. Sounds seem louder. Movements seem quicker. Your brain begins scanning the environment around you for anything unusual. Something that would normally pass by without notice suddenly feels like it could be something more. That doesn't mean there is actually a threat around you. Most of the time, it simply means your mind is in a state of heightened awareness. Many of the things people remember from childhood that feel mysterious or scary often have explanations connected to how the brain develops and processes information. When we are young, our imagination is incredibly strong. Children are constantly learning how to interpret sounds, shadows, voices, and movement. Because their understanding of the world is still forming, things that seem simple to an adult can feel confusing or even frightening to a child. When people look back years later, those memories can still carry the same emotional weight they had at the time. One example is hearing a voice or sound when you are falling asleep. This can happen during the moment when your brain moves between being awake and being asleep. That stage is sometimes called a hypnagogic state. During that time, it is actually very common for people to hear things like whispers, short sounds, music, or someone calling their name, even though there is no real source. It happens because the brain is beginning to enter a dreamlike state while you are still partly conscious. Many people experience it at least once in their life, especially when they are young or very tired. Seeing something out of the corner of your eye is another experience that almost everyone has had at some point. Human peripheral vision is designed mainly to detect motion rather than detail. Because of that, your brain often fills in missing information very quickly. If there is a shift in light, a shadow moving across the wall, or even something small like a curtain moving slightly, your brain may briefly interpret it as a person or figure. When you turn your head and look directly at it, the image disappears because there was never actually a clear object there. Moments like that can feel especially strange when you are alone in a quiet place. Your brain is trying to make sense of shapes and movement in a low-light environment. It does this very quickly because recognizing human shapes has always been important for survival. The brain sometimes guesses wrong for a split second, and that brief mistake can make it seem like you saw something that vanished. The situation with the door you mentioned could also have several ordinary causes. Doors can move or make loud noises because of air pressure changes inside a house. Heating or cooling systems turning on and off can shift air slightly, which can push a door if it is not perfectly balanced. Hinges that are a little loose or a latch that does not sit firmly can also cause a door to suddenly swing open or slam shut. At night, when everything else is quiet, those sounds feel much louder and more dramatic than they actually are. The figure you thought you saw near the doorway can also be explained by the way our brains process patterns. Humans are extremely good at recognizing faces and human shapes. Because of that, the brain sometimes sees those patterns even when they are not actually there. This effect is called pareidolia. It happens when random shapes, shadows, or lighting patterns are interpreted as something meaningful, like a face or a person standing nearby. It is the same reason people sometimes see faces in clouds or shapes in tree bark. Once your mind starts thinking that something strange might be happening, it becomes even more alert to everything around you. The brain begins paying attention to every small sound or movement. A branch scraping against a window, wind moving leaves outside, or even a small animal walking nearby can suddenly sound much bigger and more mysterious. The quiet of nighttime can amplify those feelings because there are fewer normal sounds to balance them out. What you are feeling right now is actually something many people experience after reading or hearing about creepy events. Your imagination becomes active and your mind keeps replaying the ideas you just read about. When you combine that with darkness and silence, Your brain starts creating tension even when there is no real reason for it. It is simply your thoughts reacting to the atmosphere you placed yourself in. One of the best ways to calm that feeling is to gently shift your attention away from the scary thoughts. Turning on a light can help your brain relax because darkness often makes imagination stronger. Taking a few slow breaths can also help your body settle down. When you breathe slowly and steadily, your nervous system begins to move out of that alert state. You can also give your mind something neutral to focus on. Putting on some music, a podcast, or a video where people are simply talking can break that intense silence. Background noise reminds your brain that the environment is normal and safe. Even something small like getting up to drink water, stretching your arms, or walking around the room for a minute can help reset your mood. The important thing to remember is that your mind is very powerful. When it focuses on fear, it can make ordinary things feel unusual. But the same mind can also calm itself when you shift your attention to something more relaxing. Once you give your thoughts a different direction, that uneasy feeling usually fades fairly quickly. You are not the only person who has experienced moments like this. Many people who read scary stories late at night suddenly feel as though their surroundings have changed or become more intense. It is simply the brain reacting to imagination and quietness at the same time. Right now, there is a very good chance that everything around you is completely normal. Your brain is just processing the atmosphere created by the story and the silence of the night. Try to relax a little, focus on something calm, and let your mind settle. With a bit of time, that restless feeling will pass and things will start to feel normal again. When I was around 12 years old, I had a bedroom that felt like my own little world. Like a lot of kids that age, I filled the room with things I was proud of. I had sports trophies lined up along the windowsill, small reminders of games I had played and moments when I felt like I had done something special. I also kept a large cage in the room for my iguana. The cage sat against one wall not far from the window, and it was tall enough that the top of it almost lined up with the bottom of the windowsill. The window itself was set fairly high on the wall. It wasn't the kind of window you could easily look out of while standing in the room. You had to step close and look up slightly to see outside. Beyond the glass there was a view of the street, and at night the streetlights outside cast a soft glow that filtered into the room. If you drew an imaginary line from the streetlights outside, through the window, past the trophies on the sill, and down toward the top of the iguana cage, everything lined up almost perfectly. At the time, I didn't really think much about that. It was just the way the room happened to be arranged. Most nights were completely normal. I would go to bed, fall asleep, and not wake up until morning. But every now and then, something strange would happen. I would wake up in the middle of the night for no clear reason. Maybe it was a noise, maybe it was just one of those moments when your body decides to wake up for a few minutes before falling asleep again. The room would be dark except for the faint light coming through the window from the streetlights outside. That dim orange glow would stretch across the wall and into parts of the room. When your eyes adjust to the dark, even a little bit of outside light can make shapes and shadows stand out more than you expect. One night when I woke up like that, I noticed something unusual on top of the iguana cage. At first, I thought it was just a shadow. The light from outside was shining past the trophies on the windowsill, and it looked like one of the small trophy figures was being projected down onto the top of the cage. That part made sense. Light and shadows do strange things sometimes, especially when they pass through objects at certain angles. But the thing that didn't make sense was that the shadow seemed to move. The little figure looked almost like it was alive. I remember lying there quietly in bed, staring at the top of the cage while my eyes tried to adjust to the darkness. The shadow looked like the tiny figurine that sat on one of my trophies. It had the shape of a small person standing upright, just like the kind you see on sports awards. But instead of staying still like a normal shadow would, it seemed to move its arms, slowly, almost like it was making hand motions. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. When you wake up suddenly in the middle of the night, your mind can still be halfway inside a dream. Sometimes shadows can look like things that aren't really there. Your brain fills in the details, so I convinced myself that I was probably just dreaming. But the longer I watched, the stranger it felt. The little shadow figure kept moving. Its arms shifted slightly, almost like someone trying to gesture or signal something. It didn't look random, it looked deliberate. As if the figure was trying to communicate somehow, but couldn't speak. The closest thing I could compare it to at the time was something from Star Wars. There is a scene where Chewbacca plays a game with those small holographic chess pieces that move around and fight each other on the board. The way the little shadow moved reminded me of that kind of floating, animated figure, except this was happening in my bedroom and it wasn't glowing like a hologram. It was just a shadow made by the streetlight outside. I watched it for a while, feeling both curious and confused. I don't remember feeling extremely scared at first. When you are 12 years old, your brain often jumps to simple explanations like dreams or imagination. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep. The next morning, I thought about it again and decided that I had probably imagined the whole thing. Kids have vivid dreams all the time, and it seemed much more likely that my mind had played a trick on me than that something strange was actually happening in my room. But the same thing happened again on other nights. Every once in a while, I would wake up, look toward the iguana cage, and see the shadow of the trophy figure projected onto the top of it. And each time the shadow seemed to move slightly, lifting its arms or shifting its posture like a tiny person trying to signal something. No matter how many times it happened, I kept telling myself it had to be a dream. Eventually, I stopped talking about it entirely. It was easier to assume my mind was just doing strange things when I woke up during the night. Then something happened that made me question that explanation. One night, 2 of my friends came over and ended up sleeping in my room. For whatever reason, I wasn't in the room that night. I think I may have slept somewhere else in the house or stayed up later than they did. I don't remember the exact reason anymore, but the important part is that they were the ones sleeping there. The next day, they both looked a little unsettled. One of them said something like, "Your room is kind of creepy to sleep in." At first, I laughed it off. Lots of kids say things like that when they sleep somewhere unfamiliar. But then I asked what they meant. That's when they started describing something strange they had seen during the night. They said they had woken up at some point and noticed a little moving figure on top of the iguana cage. The light from the street lamp outside had projected the shape of one of my trophies down into the room, and the little shadow looked like it was moving its arms. As they explained it, my stomach started to drop, because they were describing the exact same thing I had been seeing. The way they described it was almost identical to what I had experienced. They even mentioned that it looked like the little figure was trying to make hand motions, almost like it wanted to communicate something but couldn't speak. For a moment, I just stared at them. Then I asked a few more questions to make sure they weren't joking. But the more they talked, the clearer it became that they were completely serious. They both remembered seeing the same strange shadow moving on top of the cage. And they had seen it without me telling them anything about it beforehand. That was the moment when the whole thing stopped feeling like a dream. Until then, I had always assumed my mind was making it up because I was half asleep. But hearing 2 other people describe the same thing in the same room changed everything. Suddenly it meant that something had actually been happening in that room. Even today, I'm not completely sure what the explanation was. Maybe the angle of the streetlight and the trophies created a strange optical illusion. Maybe something outside moved the light just enough to make the shadow shift in ways that looked like movement. But the memory of it still feels strange when I think about it, because for a long time I believed it was just a dream. And then I found out that someone else had seen it too. That was the moment I realized I hadn't imagined it after all. About a year ago, I was living in a small apartment building that, at first glance, seemed completely normal. It wasn't one of those huge apartment complexes you see in big cities where hundreds of people live in the same building and nobody knows each other. This place was much smaller and quieter. The entire building only had 12 apartments in total, spread across 3 floors. Each floor had 4 units, and because of the way the building was designed, the layout was a little unusual compared to most apartment buildings. Instead of long hallways running down each floor, the apartments were arranged around circular vestibules. When you stepped out of your front door, you didn't walk into a hallway. Instead, you entered a small, round open space where the other apartment doors on that floor also faced inward. In the middle of that space was the staircase that connected all 3 floors. From the vestibule, you could look up or down through the stairwell and see the other levels of the building. Because of this layout, it was pretty hard to avoid seeing your neighbors. Even if people mostly kept to themselves, you would still pass by each other fairly often. You might see someone leaving for work in the morning or hear a door close as someone returned home late at night. Sometimes you'd run into someone on the stairs. It wasn't a very social building, but people at least recognized each other. Directly across from my apartment lived a guy who was probably in his late 20s or maybe early 30s. I never learned much about him personally, but from what little I heard around the building, he worked as a lawyer. So he seemed like the kind of person who lived a busy life. Most of the time I would see him leaving early in the morning wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. Other times I would catch a glimpse of him coming home late in the evening looking tired. He didn't seem unfriendly exactly, but he definitely kept to himself. We had never really spoken beyond the occasional quick nod or polite hello when we crossed paths near the stairs. From the outside, he looked like someone who was focused on work and not particularly interested in socializing with neighbors. There was a bit of gossip floating around the building about him, though. Someone once mentioned that his father was a very well-known lawyer in the area, someone with a lot of money and a strong reputation. The rumor was that the guy across from me was basically following the same path as his father and trying to build a similar career. I never knew if that was true or not. People in apartment buildings tend to make assumptions about each other based on small details, and rumors can spread pretty easily in places where everyone lives close together. But whether it was true or not, he seemed like someone who was trying to make a name for himself professionally. What made him more noticeable in the building, though, was his girlfriend. She lived with him, and she was clearly younger than he was. I couldn't say exactly how old she was, but she definitely looked like she was in her early 20s. At first she seemed normal enough, but after a few brief encounters with her, it became clear that she had a very intense personality. The best way I can describe it is that she always seemed nervous and suspicious. There was an energy about her that made people feel slightly uncomfortable, like she was constantly on edge. The only real conversations I ever had with her happened when she knocked on my door. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. She knocked one afternoon and asked if I had seen her boyfriend leave the building earlier that day. I told her I hadn't noticed, which was true. I worked odd hours at the time, so I wasn't always paying attention to when neighbors were coming and going, but then it happened again. A few days later, she knocked on my door and asked if I had seen him come home late the night before. Another time she asked if I had seen him talking to another woman near the building. The questions were always very direct and very personal. It quickly became clear that she was extremely suspicious of him. She seemed convinced that he might be cheating on her or hiding something. The way she asked questions made it feel like she was trying to catch him in a lie, and somehow she had decided that the neighbors might have the answers she was looking for. The problem was that I barely knew either of them. Their relationship issues had nothing to do with me, and it was always awkward standing there trying to answer her questions. Most of the time I would just shrug and tell her I hadn't seen anything. Eventually, some of the other neighbors started noticing the same behavior. People began talking about it quietly among themselves. Her jealousy had become obvious enough that it was starting to make people uneasy. A few residents had similar experiences where she asked them strange questions about her boyfriend's movements. At some point, it even turned into a dark kind of joke among a few of the neighbors. Someone once said something like, "One of these days she's going to snap and pop him." It was said half-jokingly, the way people sometimes exaggerate when talking about a couple that always seems on the edge of an argument. Nobody really believed something like that would actually happen. It was just the kind of dramatic comment people make when they see someone behaving in a very jealous or unstable way. At least that's what we all thought at the time. Then one night, everything changed. It was about a week before Halloween, and my brother had come over to my apartment to hang out. We had decided to spend the evening watching scary movies. It felt fitting since October was almost over and Halloween was coming up soon. The lights in the apartment were mostly off except for the glow of the television. We had already watched a couple of movies and were well into the night by that point. I remember it being late enough that the building had become quiet, but it wasn't extremely late yet. It was probably somewhere around 10 or 11 at night. In the middle of the movie, there was a knock at my door. It wasn't loud or frantic, just a firm knock that cut through the quiet of the apartment and immediately caught our attention. My brother and I both looked at each other. Neither of us were expecting anyone. I paused the movie and walked over to the door, wondering who it could be. When I opened it, I was surprised to see 2 police officers standing there. Right away, they told us that we needed to leave the building immediately. Their voices were calm but serious, the way police officers speak when something important is happening, but they're trying to keep people from panicking. One of them explained that there was a situation inside the building and that all residents needed to step outside while they handled it. They told us to grab anything essential and leave right away. Because of the circular layout of the floor, when I opened my door, I could see directly across the vestibule to my neighbor's apartment. His door was open, and the carpet in front of it was covered in blood. For a moment, my brain struggled to understand what I was looking at. It felt like the scene didn't belong in real life. The officer was still speaking to us, telling us to hurry and gather what we needed. But my eyes were locked on the doorway across from mine. The blood had spread across the carpet in dark patches leading out from the apartment. It wasn't a small amount either. It was enough that you could instantly tell something very serious had happened. My brother stepped up behind me and saw it too. For a second, we both just stood there, frozen. Then the officer repeated that we needed to move. That snapped me out of it. I quickly went back into the apartment and grabbed a few things in case we wouldn't be allowed back inside that night. My phone, my wallet, a jacket. At the time, I had no idea what was happening or how long the building would be closed. Within a few minutes, we were outside with the other residents who had been evacuated. People were gathered in small groups on the sidewalk and in the parking area. But everyone looked confused and worried. Some neighbors were whispering to each other, trying to figure out what had happened inside the building. More police cars and emergency vehicles started arriving. Not long after that, EMTs came out of the building carrying a body bag down the stairs. The entire crowd went quiet when people realized what they were seeing. The story started spreading almost immediately among the residents. My neighbor's girlfriend had shot him multiple times, and the gun she used belonged to him. Apparently, the shooting had happened inside the apartment after some kind of argument. From what we later heard, she had shot him several times in the head. No one seemed to know exactly what started the fight or how things escalated so quickly. What still feels strange to me is that my brother and I didn't hear anything at all. Our apartment was directly across from theirs. Gunshots are incredibly loud. In a small building like that, you would expect the sound to echo through the walls and stairwell. But we had been sitting there watching movies the entire time. We didn't hear any shouting. We didn't hear any crashing sounds. We didn't hear a single gunshot. The only thing we heard that night was the knock on the door from the police telling us to leave. Later, after everything was over, I thought back to those comments people had made about her snapping one day. At the time, those jokes had seemed exaggerated, like people were just being dramatic about a couple with obvious relationship problems. None of us really believed something like that would actually happen. But sometimes the things people joke about turn out to be closer to reality than anyone expects. Even now, the moment that stays with me the most is opening my door and seeing that blood-covered carpet across the vestibule. It's the kind of image that stays in your mind forever. Thank you for spending your night with me. I hope these lullabies stay with you, but not too close. If you found these stories chilling, please like the video and subscribe to join the family. Every comment and sub helps us keep the darkness growing. Get as comfortable as you can, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Sweet dreams.